So what is the plan that the young people cook up in Boccaccio's Decameron? They decide to go to a house together in Fiesole, just outside Florence, for 10 days. And on each of these days, each one of them will tell a story, which is obviously adds up to 100 stories. What is the reason for their plan? In part, they're fleeing physical sickness, but they're also fleeing threats to their psychological health. They mention these things: the constant discussion of the plague, the constant listening to statistics about the dead, the depression of wandering around this gloomy, half-closed city. What can we learn in the 21st century from their plan? First of all, I think that we need a break from the news cycle. They repeat this over and over again. You can't just sit listening to news about the pandemic. Second, that psychic survival is necessary. You have to take action to protect it. Finally, that distraction is a duty not only to yourself, but also to others. The plan is in part designed to compensate for some of the things that the young people have lost by being in quarantine in the midst of a pandemic. Travel, for example, work and colleagues or schoolmates, romance, or just in general, the possibility of new life experiences. They respond to this by drawing down on what they've already had. When new experiences are limited, old ones can be reactivated in our minds and shared with others. Journeys we've already taken, things we already know, people we've already met. The results of drawing down is a strengthened sense of self, something that is under pressure in lockdown, a strengthened sense of connection to others. The plan in and of itself is a response to the pandemic and to the experience of being on lockdown. The stories are supposed to provide the young people with a distraction from the misery of the plague. I think as readers too, and I hope you felt this, when we move from the gloomy introduction, which describes the plague in Florence, to the first story, we feel a sense of relief and catharsis, a feeling of the world suddenly opening up. The stories themselves are not about plagues or sickness. They're about other things: the role of luck, the power of the human will, relationships between men and women, love stories that go well, love stories that go badly, crime, deceit, virtuous conduct, and so on. However, in subtle, invisible ways, these stories address the distortions of life in pandemic. They offer a kind of rewiring of the mind, almost as a way to prepare the listeners or the readers to return to normal life. The Italian filmmaker Pierpaolo Pasolini made a film of the Decameron in 1971. For Pasolini, the stories in the Decameron were a celebration of the life of the body and exuberant sexuality. Pasolini's version removes the plague frame story. Instead, for him, these medieval stories were a sort of subtle counterpart to the earlier repressions of the church and fascism in 20th century Italy. But in the written text, the exuberance of the stories directly counteracts the dull, gloomy world of the plague. The 100 stories in the Decameron all deal subtly with the challenges of pandemic and quarantine. If you have time, you should read more of those stories, but we're going to end by looking at one of them. Ciappelletto was the name of the story that you read for today. What, you might ask, has this story got to do with the plague? In the description of the plague, people were reduced to statistics or types. But here we have an individual who is unclassifiable. He's not a statistic and he's not a type. In fact, he resists all attempts to define and classify him. He controls his own reputation. He's a liar, a merchant, a glutton, but he ends up at the end as a famous holy saint. Ciappelletto or Ciapparello might be a rogue, but he also represents, I think, a restoration of human individuality, which has been erased in the pandemic. This is the way he's described in the story. Ciapparello was a notary, and though he issued few instruments, nothing caused him greater shame than when one of them was found to be anything other than fraudulent. What really made him happy, what he really applied himself to, was to sow discord, enmity, and scandal between friends, kinsmen, and whoever else. Obviously, there's an ironic tone in this, and Boccaccio is certainly not glorifying fraud. However, there is an emphasis on the power of communication, on the ability of people to affect each other mentally, and I think this is a response to the problem of closeness. The description of Ciapparello is colourful and vibrant and full of energy. The text also tells us that Ciappelletto was gay, now, which is obviously considered a grave sin in Boccaccio's time. The text has a colourful and roundabout way of telling us this, and you might have missed it. So go back and find it. Even though these are supposedly sinful things at the time, and certainly the text is not commending any of these aspects of his lifestyle, it's unmistakably narrated with gusto and pleasure. There's also a focus, in all of this gusto and pleasure, there's a focus on appetites. In the opening description of plague-ridden Florence, appetites were animal, shameful things. Here, the appetites for sex, for food, for drink are restored to the open, to the individual. At the end of the story, Ciappelletto becomes venerated as a saint who's considered to perform helpful miracles for his devotees after he dies. In the introduction, when the description of the plague closest to another person, especially a sick body or a dead body, or its close, implies contagion or death. But this first story ends with proximity to another as something that is not just positive, but miraculous and life-giving.